Queen Elizabeth I of England and Mary Queen of Scots were two of recorded history's most significant, most legendary rivals, although they never met. Elizabeth was the childless virgin queen in one castle, bawdy, brilliant, tactical and cynical. On the other hand, Mary is feminine, charming, romantic and reckless. Their decades-long battle over the English crown would end with Mary's beheading at Fotheringhay Castle, with Elizabeth's blessing in 1587. But the two cousins' tortured relationship was determined long before, during childhoods so dissimilar and defining that they would inform both queens' characters and seal Mary's tragic fate. The rivalry between the two queens was marked by imprisonment, escape, and execution. Mary, Queen of Scots, towered over her contemporaries in more ways than one. Not only was she a female monarch in an era dominated by men, but she was also physically imposing, standing nearly 6 feet tall. Her height emphasised Mary's seemingly innate queenship. Enthroned as Scotland's ruler at just 6 days old, she spent her formative years at the French court, where she was raised alongside her future husband, Francis II. Wed to the Dauphin in April 1558, 16-year-old Mary, already so renowned for her beauty that she was deemed la plus parfaite, or the most perfect, ascended to the French throne the following July, officially asserting her influence beyond her home country to the European continent. As Mary donned dual crowns, the new English queen, her cousin Elizabeth Tudor, consolidated power on the other side of the Channel. Unlike her Scottish counterpart, whose position as the only legitimate child of James V cemented her royal status, Elizabeth followed a protracted path to the throne.
Elizabeth is just the most fascinating figure. She is born the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, and she is a crushing disappointment because, of course, she isn't a boy. She spends a difficult childhood and a difficult early adulthood really trying to find her place in the line of succession and in the royal family. She finally becomes queen on the death of her half-sister Mary in November 1558. And I mean, her accession is just an amazing achievement because it's so unexpected. If you'd asked Henry VIII back at his death to rank his children, Elizabeth would definitely be the least of his children. And yet, actually, she is the one that we really remember. She reigns for 44 years, and it's remembered as a time of general prosperity. It's the age of Shakespeare, it's the age of exploration, and Elizabeth's right at the centre, reigning alone.
Now, some historians have suggested that Henry was furious at Anne for the delivery of a daughter, and indeed that this was the beginning of the end of their relationship. But actually we have good evidence that Henry consoled Anne and suggested that the delivery of a healthy daughter was a good sign for the sons that would follow.
Bastardized following the 1536 execution of her mother, Anne Boleyn, she spent her childhood at the mercy of the changing whims of her father, Henry VIII. Upon his death in 1547, she was named third in the line of succession, eligible to rule only in the unlikely event that her siblings, Edward VI and Mary I, died without heirs, which is precisely what happened.
In 1552, Edward contracts the measles, and although he recovers from this illness, it is possible that it suppressed his immune system, for in 1553, Edward was gravely ill, perhaps with tuberculosis. At this time, he had no heir, he hadn't had an opportunity to marry, and therefore the question of the succession was a pressing one for him. His resolution was to disinherit both of his sisters from the line of succession. He did not want the country to revert to Roman Catholicism, as it almost certainly would if Mary inherited the throne. And he also knew that Henry VIII had delegitimised both of his sisters. This would lead their succession very vulnerable indeed. In the wake of Edward's death, Lady Jane Grey is suddenly proclaimed queen, but Jane is only to reign for a mere 9 days. For Mary has the support of the kingdom and also of the nobles. Mary proclaims herself queen at Fotheringhay Castle, and she writes to the nobility to ask for their support, and support them they do. After only 5 years on the throne and having provided no heir, Mary dies in 1558, leaving her throne begrudgingly to her Protestant sister, Elizabeth.
Elizabeth was the monarch, but it's a man's world. Monarch is really the only office that is open to a woman in Tudor England. So Elizabeth's government is made up entirely of men. And she immediately sets about appointing her council. She inherits some councillors from Mary, of course, but quickly sets about sending them on their way, because actually Mary has had a very large and unworkable household.
She's a woman of Renaissance. She killed very few people compared with her father, who sort of did it without thinking about it. She suppressed uprisings, particularly at the beginning of her reign, and hard and fast. What she could do was pick brilliant advisors. She was not going to get married. I will be master and mistress in my own kingdom. And on top of that, she made sure then she could barter with all these other countries for their hand. She was astute. She took her time. She didn't snatch at things like her father did. And she ruled us for nearly 45 years, against all the odds in many ways for ruling on her own. But actually, when you look at her Privy Council, there was nothing alone about it.
I think Elizabeth learned a huge amount about how vulnerable women were to their husbands, how subservient they had to be. And Elizabeth was also keenly aware from her sister Mary's example that in order to rule as a woman in your own right, you really had to do so alone. Because when a husband is introduced into the equation, he automatically becomes king and therefore superior to the queen.
When Elizabeth became queen, England was a Catholic country. And so the question of what the state religion would be was really on everybody's lips, because she was well known to be a Protestant. In 1559, she created her religious settlement, where she set the state religion, and it was a Protestant church. The Church of England was Protestant. However, it wasn't as Protestant, as staunchly Protestant as it had been in her brother Edward's reign. So Elizabeth tried to take something of a compromise approach, something of a middle way. Her own inclination wasn't to be quite as Puritan, which is a hotter sort of Protestant, as her brother had been. And for example, she liked to keep a silver crucifix in the Chapel Royal on the altar, something that was hugely offensive to the Puritans at her court. And Elizabeth wasn't really focused on actual belief. It was said of her that she didn't want to make windows into men's souls, which means she didn't really care what you believed inwardly. What she wanted was outward conformity. She wanted you sitting in your pew on a Sunday in the Church of England service.
As the Queen of England, Elizabeth I was the beauty standard, and women all across the country looked to her for inspiration. Her fiery red hair was considered to be very beautiful.
In 1562, Elizabeth felt unwell and said that she would take a bath. And the next day it became apparent that she was suffering from severe smallpox. It was a constitutional crisis. Smallpox is obviously a very deadly disease, and it was looking like she would die. And of course, she was the last Tudor. There was nobody else. So her council met to decide who would take the throne, and it was a very confused picture. If you look at strict hereditary, the heir to the throne was Mary, Queen of Scots, who was unlikely to appeal to anyone in England. She's a Catholic. She's educated in France. She's a foreign ruler. So it's a real constitutional crisis, and the Privy Council meet to decide who will be the heir.
Mary Queen of Scots was 5'11". She had long red gold hair. She had high cheekbones. She had a beautiful, soft... Her eyes were like a hazel colour, we seem to hear. And of course, her skin would be like new milk because she's red-haired. So she was beautiful, which is described as graceful. She has a wit about her, a soft wit. Mary, Queen of Scots, when she came here, she'd lived in Scotland, had to learn Lowland Scots because she'd lived in France from the age of 5 right up till she left at 18. And her mother was French, Mary of Guise, so she spoke French, obviously, all the time there. But she had to learn Lowland Scot to come back, not the Gaelic. So she was beautiful and gentle. There's no question she had sex appeal. And she was graceful and she had real style. She was profoundly religious in the way that she saw the Catholic faith. And she's fertile. But above all other things, she's had a son with Tudor blood in his veins. James.
It's unsurprising that the tale of these two queens resonates with audiences some 400 years after the leading players lived. Mary's story is about murder, sex, pathos, religion, and unsuitable lovers. Add in the Scottish Queen's rivalry with Elizabeth and her untimely end, and she transforms into the archetypal tragic heroine.
Mary, Queen of Scots, is undoubtedly Elizabeth's rival. They are two parallel queens, two queens in one aisle. Mary was born in 1542, and when she was 6 days old, she became reigning Queen of Scotland. She's the Queen of Scots from birth, almost. She had a very troubled upbringing before being sent to France, where she was engaged to the French Dauphin, the heir to the French throne. She becomes Queen of France very briefly, but then when her husband dies, she returns to Scotland as an independent ruler. Mary is undoubtedly the biggest threat to Elizabeth, and this is because of her place in the English succession. Henry VIII, of course, had 3 children. None of them have any heirs. He has no surviving brothers, so his next heirs are his sisters, Margaret, the elder sister, and Mary, the younger. Margaret, the elder sister, marries James IV of Scots, and she has 2 surviving children. Margaret, the elder sister, is the grandmother of Mary, Queen of Scots, so Mary is effectively her heir. She is the next hereditary heir to the throne. And this really matters to Elizabeth because Elizabeth is still legally illegitimate, so legally she has no title to the throne other than by Act of Parliament and by her father's will. When Mary Tudor, Mary I, dies, Mary, Queen of Scots, actually declares herself Queen of England because by the laws of hereditary, she is next heir to the throne. Although she later abandons those claims, Elizabeth, of course, is well aware of Mary's position in succession, and she is incredibly dangerous to Elizabeth's rule.
I think Elizabeth chose not to marry for a number of different reasons. I think it began at an early age. I think she knew from the example set by firstly her mother and then her stepmother, Catherine Howard, how vulnerable a queen could be at the hands of a king. I think this left a psychological imprint on Elizabeth's mind. I think the thought of marrying terrified her, quite frankly. But also, Elizabeth was determined, perhaps for the first time in her life, to have control over herself and of her kingdom. She had been left incredibly vulnerable by the downfall of her mother, and she had been delegitimized, she had been removed from the succession. And I think in a way, Elizabeth wanted to rule without a husband. She knew that if she had married, her husband would automatically have become a king regnant. And Elizabeth wanted control, not only of her own destiny, but that of her kingdom too.
Elizabeth actually receives a deputation from the House of Commons not long after she becomes queen, where they petition her to marry. And she takes it in very good grace. Since I've been a child, I have decided that I'm going to remain unmarried, that I'm going to be a virgin. I'm going to reign as a virgin queen. And it doesn't really cause any stir, which is surprising, but it really is because just nobody believed her. I mean, it was a ridiculous suggestion that this young girl of 25 would hope to reign as queen. Of course she had to marry. Of course she had to give England a king. Her role was to produce heirs to continue the dynasty.
When Elizabeth became queen, there was still a lot of prejudice around the idea of having a woman in charge of the country. People still believed that that was a man's job and that the title of queen meant you were a companion to a king. Elizabeth had to balance these roles, man and woman, king and queen, and she did this by incorporating masculine and feminine elements into her clothes. There are lots of paintings of Elizabeth wearing doublets, a type of male's dress, and she did so to project this idea of her being half king and half queen, and capable of performing both of those roles.
Elizabeth unfortunately suffered many illnesses during her early reign, including catching smallpox. This created great anxiety throughout the country, and not least in her council. Elizabeth, of course, was unmarried at this point. She had no children, no heir. What would happen to the Tudor dynasty if she were to die without one?
Although a reigning queen does retain some authority, their husband will become king and will be deferred to and become the dominant party. And we can see this with Mary I, who marries Philip of Spain, and he becomes King of England. We can see this in Scotland, where Mary Queen of Scots marries Henry Lord Darnley, and he becomes King Henry of Scots. So Elizabeth is expected to marry and give England a king, because rule by a female is seen as unnatural.
Although she was famously dubbed the Virgin Queen, Elizabeth only embraced this chaste persona during the later years of her reign. At the height of her power, she juggled proposals from foreign rulers and subjects alike, always prevaricating rather than revealing the true nature of her intentions. In doing so, the English Queen avoided falling under a man's dominion and maintained the possibility of a marriage treaty as a bargaining chip. At the same time, she prevented herself from producing an heir, effectively ending the Tudor dynasty after just 3 generations.
Elizabeth crafted herself this image of the Virgin Queen, and this was reinforced in her fashion. One of the things that Elizabeth did was wear her hair down, and that was something that was typically only expected of unmarried young women. She also exposed a liberal amount of décolletage, which was also something associated with younger women, right the way up until her death. Pearls were a key part of her look. They symbolised purity, and she picked the colours black and white to be her colours. They represented purity and they represented consistency.
Elizabeth's regime very much uses propaganda, and Elizabeth is so adept at it, to the extent that actually even today we still to some extent buy into her propaganda. We think about her as the Virgin Queen or as Gloriana. She's almost always right at the top of any poll of British monarchs. She knew exactly how to present herself. Partly, she uses the imagery of the Virgin Queen, and we'll see this often in portraits of her. She has pearls, which symbolise her purity. And this actually, to some extent, fills a gap which had been left by the Virgin Mary, because, of course, Protestants do not prioritise the Virgin Mary. She's no longer the principal saint. So in many respects, Elizabeth fills that role and receives the adoration of her subjects. She's goddess-like in surviving literature, and also the way people refer to her. She also very much uses her femininity to her advantage in her propaganda, because actually being a woman is a major disadvantage for a ruler in the period, and yet actually she is able to use this and to turn it round. So there are contemporaries talk of being in love with Elizabeth. She's seen as ageless, eternally beautiful. She's the fairy queen. She's Gloriana. And actually again we can see this in her portraits, because she doesn't age. When we see portraits of Elizabeth, we're seeing Elizabeth through the mirror of propaganda. So her face remains white and unlined and beautiful throughout her reign. It's only paintings painted after her death where we actually start to see the aging queen, because any portrait that was unflattering would simply be destroyed.
Elizabeth was keenly aware of her tenuous hold on the crown from the beginning of her reign. As a Protestant, she faced threats from England's Catholic faction, which favoured a rival claim to the throne, that of Mary, the Catholic Queen of Scots, over hers. In the eyes of the Catholic Church, Elizabeth was the illegitimate product of an unlawful marriage. At the same time, Mary, the paternal granddaughter of Henry VIII's older sister Margaret, was the rightful English heir.
Religious and political tension was rife in the Elizabethan period, and people utilised dress as a way of showing their allegiance to different factions. Jewellery was a very helpful way of doing this. Religious symbols such as crucifixes or the IHS pendant, they appeared frequently in dress to show where people's allegiances lay. It was important to show your loyalty to the crown, and lots of people chose to dress in black and white, which Elizabeth had picked as her colours, or used her symbols such as the armillary sphere. Elizabeth's cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots, was a proud Catholic, and she wanted everyone to know that. At her execution, she removed her outer gown to reveal a bright crimson underdress. This was incredibly significant. Crimson was the colour of Catholic martyrdom, and she was sending a message to the world that she believed she had been wronged by her political enemies, and that to the end she would stay loyal to her faith.
I think it is safe to say that Elizabeth was a Protestant. But when she came to the throne, she knew that she had to be pragmatic. She knew that she needed to unify her kingdom, and therefore she tried to enact a policy, almost a don't ask and don't say. She stated that she had no desire to open windows into men's souls, and this must have been something of a relief to her kingdom. However, there were Catholic factions who were entirely opposed to Elizabeth's rule. They deemed her as illegitimate because of how her mother had been executed. And therefore, I think it's safe to say that Elizabeth became increasingly intolerant of those with a Catholic faith. She saw them as foreign. She didn't believe that they could be trusted. And this was compounded by numerous plots against her life that were enacted by Catholics. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Elizabeth's first cousin, and she had something of a tempestuous rule in Scotland. Indeed, she was forced to abdicate her throne because of her actions. Mary was forced to flee to England and to seek refuge with her cousin Elizabeth. But Elizabeth knew that Mary, as a Catholic, would become a figurehead for those who opposed Elizabeth's rule. Indeed, people already thought that Mary had a more legitimate claim to the English throne. Therefore, Mary was essentially placed in house arrest for the rest of her life.
Mary was a Catholic queen in a predominantly Protestant state, but she formed compromises that enabled her to maintain authority without infringing on the practice of either religion. As she settled into her new role, although crowned Queen of Scotland in infancy, she spent much of her early reign in France, leaving first her mother, Mary of Guise, and then her half-brother James, Earl of Moray, to act as regent on her behalf. She sought to strengthen the relations with her southern neighbour, Elizabeth. The Tudor Queen pressured Mary to ratify the 1560 Treaty of Edinburgh, which would have prevented her from making any claim to the English throne. Still, she refused, appealing to Elizabeth as queens in one isle, of one language, the nearest kinswoman that each other had. To Elizabeth, such familial ties were of little value. Given her precious hold on the throne and the subsequent paranoia that plagued her reign, she had little motivation to name a successor who could threaten her safety. Mary's blood claim was worrying enough, but acknowledging it by naming her as the heir presumptive would leave Elizabeth vulnerable to coups organised by England's Catholic faction. This fear-driven logic even extended to the Queen's potential offspring. As she once told Mary's advisor William Maitland, "Princes cannot like their children. Think you that I could love my own winding sheet?" Despite these concerns, Elizabeth certainly considered the possibility of naming Mary her heir. The pair exchanged regular correspondence, trading warm sentiments and discussing the possibility of meeting face to face, but the two never actually met in person. Any in-person encounter between the Scottish and English queens would have raised the question of precedence, forcing Elizabeth to declare whether Mary was her heir or not. The fact that the cousins never stood face to face precludes the possibility of the intensely personal dynamic often projected onto them. After all, it's difficult to maintain strong feelings about someone only known through letters and intermediaries. Instead, it's more likely that the Queen's attitudes toward each other were primarily dictated by changing circumstances.
After she realised she couldn't stay in Scotland any longer, Mary fled to England, and it was the absolute worst decision she could have taken, because Elizabeth was the one person who could never allow Mary to have her freedom, because Mary is such a threat to her rule. When Elizabeth hears that Mary has landed in the north of England, she orders that she be placed under house arrest. And Mary remains imprisoned by Elizabeth for 20 years. The two women never meet. Mary is desperate to come to court to plead her case with Elizabeth, but Elizabeth will not see her. Instead, Mary slowly begins to lose hope, and she starts plotting against Elizabeth. And there are several plots, at least, that her name is mentioned in, or that she seems to have had direct involvement in. Lastly, of course, she is involved in the Babington plot, where she gives her consent to murder Elizabeth. And in many respects, this is a really sensible policy for Mary, because actually, were Elizabeth to die at any point during Mary's imprisonment, it's really likely that Mary would be declared Queen of England. She knows that there's just one heartbeat between her and the English succession.
What's so interesting about the Mary Queen of Scots and Elizabeth idea is Elizabeth was actually due to visit here in 1571, but Mary had already been, so she sort of called off. I don't think I want to breathe the same air. Mary was prisoner here for the very first time on the 2nd of February 1569. Before that time, having escaped from Scotland, Mary Stuart had been in Carlisle, where she crossed over, in a boat and was there for a while. Then she travelled down to England, and all that time she was under house keep, because Elizabeth was taking the pulse of every royal house of Europe with her ambassadors, and the quotes were, "We have the Scotch Queen. Do you want her?" But apparently not. So when Mary came here on the 2nd of February 1569, she was told, and this castle was absolutely vast and full of streets and crowded and horses moving around, all these things going on, she was told she was now a prisoner. And of course, she was being questioned about the death of her second husband, Darnley, who was a really horrible man, actually. That doesn't mean he's entitled to be murdered, or entitled to murder him, rather. But what it does mean is that she had some answering to do, because he was very, very close to the English throne in succession. And he was, no doubt about it, murdered. Many people believed she was colluded with her third husband, Bothwell.
Elizabeth had perhaps been astute when imprisoning her cousin Mary, for indeed Mary did conspire to overthrow Elizabeth and to place herself on the English throne. Elizabeth reluctantly signed her cousin's death warrant, and this was a really difficult move on Elizabeth's part. She knew that the execution of anointed queen could set a precedent. So we can perhaps understand Elizabeth's reluctance at making this move.
So when she came here, she had two dead husbands, second murdered. First husband, Francois, France, the Dauphin, died young, at 17 years of age. And then she marries Darnley. And I mean, Elizabeth must have laughed when she married him, because she's reported to have saying, "Oh, don't marry her." So she sends a beautiful young man in line to the English throne, because she knew his morals were in the gutter. His behaviour was generally appalling, and the lairds of Scotland were disgusted this man had come amongst them. And the sovereignty being looked after by a child, a minority sovereignty as it's called, had gone on in Scotland since the early to mid-1400s, right the way through it. And Mary herself had been as well a child of 6 days old when she came to the throne. So there was all this stuff going on in the background. So when she arrived here, there were these murders and death associated with her, and on top of that, she'd been locked up in Scotland. She'd escaped. There'd been the Battle of Langside, and she had escaped into England. Her third husband by then was going mad in a jail in Denmark. He was chained to a concrete post going round and round like a dog, and he was extremely attractive and a cousin, and in there lies a lot of the problem. So there's that. She'd left behind her son, James, who she'd signed over to for the regency of her bastard half-brother Murray. He'd been after it for a long time. And she'd lost her son, her kingdom, and her dignity, because at this point she is being shown on leaflets as a crowned mermaid, which is a prostitute, and the running hair at the bottom, which is the symbol of Bothwell.
Mary married a total of 3 times, as she told Elizabeth's ambassador soon before her July 1565 wedding to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, "Not to marry, you know it cannot be for me." Darnley, Mary's first cousin through her paternal grandmother, proved to be a highly unsuitable match, displaying a greed for power that culminated in his orchestration of the March 9th, 1566 murder of the Queen's secretary, David Rizzio.
It had been proved without doubt that Mary had consented to murder Elizabeth. Elizabeth knew that Mary wanted her dead. She agrees that Mary should be tried, and of course she's tried for treason. And actually, a treason trial against Mary is quite difficult constitutionally, because actually she's a foreign ruler. Can she be tried for treason? But she is, and she's sentenced to death. And this is a real problem for Elizabeth. She, like Mary, is a rare example of a reigning queen, and she really doesn't want to set a precedent for executing a fellow queen. And Mary is also one of her closest relatives. Elizabeth doesn't have many relatives. She's agonized previously over killing the Duke of Norfolk, who was a cousin of hers on her mother's side. And it's a similar approach with Mary. She just cannot bring herself to sign a death warrant. Finally, after considerable urging from her council, she does sign the warrant and gives it to her secretary. And it is immediately dispatched because the council know Elizabeth is likely to change her mind. And she does almost immediately, but it's too late and Mary is executed.
Relations between Mary and Elizabeth had soured following the Scottish Queen's union with Darnley, which the English Queen viewed as threatening her throne. But by February 1567, tensions had thawed enough for Mary to name Elizabeth protector of her infant son, the future James VI of Scotland and First of England. Then, news of another killing broke. This time, the victim was Darnley himself. 3 months after Darnley's death, Mary wed the man accused of, and acquitted of in a legally suspected trial, his murder. James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, was a vainglorious, rash and hazardous young man, according to Ambassador Nicholas Throckmorton. Despite his differences from Darnley, he had a violent temper and shared the deceased king's proclivity for power. Regardless of whether sexual attraction, love or faith in Bothwell as her protector against the feuding Scottish lords guided Mary's decision, her alignment with him cemented her downfall. In the summer of 1567, the increasingly unpopular queen was imprisoned and forced to abdicate in favour of her son. Bothwell fled to Denmark, where he died in captivity 11 years later. In May 1568, Mary escaped and rallied supporters for a final battle. Defeated once and for all, the deposed queen fled to England, expecting her sister queen to offer a warm welcome and perhaps even help her regain the Scottish throne. Instead, Elizabeth placed Mary, an anointed monarch over whom she had no absolute jurisdiction, under de facto house arrest, consigning her to 18 years of imprisonment under what can only be described as legally grey circumstances.
It must have been absolutely terrifying for her to come here and be told this. In fact, it was so terrifying that she vomited black blood, sign of an ulcer, collapsed across the neck of the horse, was held down, they made her walk in here. All this had happened, and she wasn't even 27. So you can see why some of the courts of Europe might have been a bit concerned about the choices that she'd made. And in fact, she historically, we have much record of her saying, my heart is my own. Well, it isn't. She's not a shepherdess running through a field. Her heart and her womb belong to her people, and the decisions she makes should be for the purposes of trade and peace, for the nation's sake. And of course, Elizabeth was going to be a master and mistress in her own kingdom, wasn't she? And Elizabeth had her locked up for nearly 19 years, so she was here 4 times in total, the last time for 11 months. And then the Babington plot happened and she went from here. And she didn't know that all was known. She didn't know that one of her closest associates was a double agent. And all of these things meant that this is a woman who was constantly confronted by betrayal.
Mary Queen of Scots' execution sent shockwaves through Europe, not least in the devoutly Catholic Kingdom of Spain. So much so that this really was the spark of what would become known as the Spanish Armada. Elizabeth really showed her mettle at a speech that she gave at Tilbury, and this is where the mythology of Elizabeth really starts. The truth of the matter is that it was more the weather than anything that Elizabeth had done that was the downfall of the Armada. But this is where Elizabeth, the powerful Virgin Queen, really comes into prominence. It is at this point that the mythology of Elizabeth begins.
Mary's execution was a shocking event. She was an anointed queen, a monarch in her own right. It shocked Europe. While Mary's son James, who had his eye very much on the English throne, was prepared to forgive and forget in his relations with Elizabeth, Catholic Europe were outraged at the execution because Mary, of course, had been a Queen of France and she's also a Catholic monarch. And her death was very much staged by her to show herself as a martyr, as a Catholic martyr. Philip of Spain, England's former king, who had been on hostile terms with Elizabeth for several years, was equally outraged. He very much saw himself as a defender of Catholicism, and he took up Mary's cause. And it's really Mary's execution that lit the spark of war with Spain and ultimately leads to the Spanish Armada.
The denouement of Mary and Elizabeth's decades-long power struggle is easily recalled by even the most casual of observers. On February the 8th, 1587, the deposed Scottish Queen knelt at an execution block, uttered a string of final prayers, and stretched out her arms to assent to the fall of the headsman's axe. 3 strikes later, the executioner severed Mary's head from her body, at which point he held up his bloody prize and shouted, "God save the Queen." For now, at least, Elizabeth had emerged victorious. Around 8 a.m. on February the 8th, 1587, the 44-year-old Scottish Queen knelt in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle and thanked the headsman for making an end of all my troubles. 3 axe blows later, she was dead. Her severed head lofted high as a warning to all who defied Elizabeth Tudor.
Elizabeth was destined to be the last of her dynasty, and of course she knew this. She had no children, she had no nephews and nieces. There was no one else to carry on the Tudor line. So in part, of course, her legacy is dynastic change and the fact that the King of Scots became the King of England and united the 2 kingdoms. But her legacy is so much more than this. Although she's not the first English reigning queen or the first reigning queen in the island of Britain, she was undoubtedly the woman that proved that women could reign in England. She reigned for over 40 years and she reigned independently. She didn't have a king and she was very much in control of her kingdom. And I think that's her greatest legacy, really. It is her contribution to English queenship. All subsequent reigning queens have to some extent modelled themselves on Elizabeth. We see this with Queen Anne in the 18th century, for example, who, when she becomes queen, she actually takes as her motto, Semper Idem, always the same. And this was the motto of Elizabeth I. And so this is her legacy. She is the first truly great reigning queen on the island of Britain. And very much, this is a legacy that she passed on to subsequent generations.
Elizabeth died childless, and at the end of her reign came the end of the Tudor dynasty. I think Elizabeth's greatest legacy was bringing a sense of national identity to England once more.
There's a lot of debate surrounding the reason why Elizabeth I died, and there is a theory that her makeup might have been the cause. The lead that she used to give herself her famous pale complexion may have contributed to her death.
The Tudor dynasty is an era of such big characters. We have Henry VIII, we have Anne Boleyn, we have Elizabeth I, but we also have non-royals. We have Thomas Cromwell, we have William Cecil, we have Robert Dudley trying to marry the Queen. These individuals are so interesting in themselves. And it's also an age of big events. It's where the Reformation happens. It's the age of William Shakespeare. So we have the stage, we have the first permanent theatres. It's the age of exploration. We have Sir Walter Raleigh attempting to plant his first European colony in the New World. So there are big events and there are big personalities. And there are also surprising things like the 6 wives of Henry VIII, which really draws people's attention because it was unprecedented. It was seen as bizarre, even crazy, that the king had 6 wives back in the 16th century, and today it still holds our interest. There was no dynasty like the Tudor dynasty for drama.
I think we're all still so obsessed with the Tudors because of how unrealistic it all is. If this had been the work of fiction, we would think it was pushing credulity. I mean, this is a family who killed one another. This is a family who had a king with 6 queens who killed 2 of them. This is a family with feuding siblings. It has everything for us to enjoy, and we can't get enough of it. The Tudor dynasty was defined by a change in religion, a consolidation of power, and also the ability to look outwards and both inwards. This is an era defined by great cultural advances in the arts, but also as an age of exploration and empire. The Tudors really are central to our sense of national identity.
On a surface level, Elizabethan style didn't disappear once Elizabeth I had died. What she did that was incredibly important for the future of fashion, particularly royal fashion, was change the way the power could be displayed. Subsequent monarchs would look back at Elizabeth as the golden standard of how to show the world who you are and why you're important.
Actually, I think one of Elizabeth's greatest legacies was demonstrating that a queen could rule in her own right without a man. She was a queen who did not need a king.
Both queens were surprisingly fluid in their religious inclinations. Her adversaries primarily invented Mary's promiscuous reputation, while Elizabeth's reign was filled with rumours of her purported romances. Whereas Mary aged in the relative isolation of house arrest, Elizabeth's looks were under constant scrutiny. Mary, Queen of Scots, may have been the monarch who got her head chopped off. Still, she eventually proved triumphant in a roundabout way. After Elizabeth died childless in 1603, it was Mary's son, James VI of Scotland and first of England, who ascended to the throne as the first to rule a united British kingdom. The Queen herself predicted in an eerily prescient motto, "In my end is my beginning."